Next, from Springfield, we talked to Taylor Pensoneau, a former reporter with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch who covered Illinois politics, about his recollections of certain Illinois politicians, why nothing is getting done in Springfield, the effect of Illinois political power being concentrated in Chicago, and his advice for aspiring journalists. This runs about 1 hour.
Taylor Pensoneau, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Glad to be here with you, Terry.
It's been a while since we spoke. You are, for the audience, just to remind you, started out some 50-something years ago as a young reporter covering Illinois politics for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
Right.
Subsequently worked as the head of the Co-Association, and for the last, 15 or so years have been an author and produced a number of books.
That's
on
right.
Some of the historical figures that you covered as a reporter.
Right. Right.
We thought it would be interesting as we look toward the bicentennial of the state of Illinois and celebrate 200 years that you covered a significant chapter and people who were significant in the development of where we are today.
Absolutely.
During your time as a reporter, we have this current state constitution written. Technology, as everyone knows, as far as the technology of reporting, has greatly transformed journalism. Let's start off just in the beginning. Let's go back to, when was it that you started reporting for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch?
I came to the Post-Dispatch, Terry, in 1962, right after graduation from the University of Missouri School of Journalism. And I was, for 3 years, a general assignment reporter on the streets of St. Louis for the Post-Dispatch. And then in 1965, the Post decided to reactivate a dormant bureau in the press room in the Illinois State House. And they gave me an opportunity to fill that role. It was a terrific opportunity for a young guy, 24, 25 years old. And I started here in October of 1965. And for 12 years, I was the Illinois political writer for the Post-Dispatch up until early 1978, when I left the Post-Dispatch. I left big city daily journalism and accepted an offer to go to work for the Illinois coal mining industry.
When you were covering in the 60s, and again, what year did you just say you left daily reporting?
Early 1978.
So you had covered Otto Kerner as governor. Did you cover any of Bill Scranton as governor?
I did not. I got to know Bill Stratton, but I never covered him. No, Otto Kerner was governor.
I misspoke. I may have misspoke.
Otto Kerner was governor when I arrived on the scene here.
Let's start with Otto Kerner,
Right.
Who later went to jail. We joke, kind of black humor about how many governors have gone to jail. A number of the governors who have gone to jail went to jail not as for what they did during their governorship necessarily, but some did and some didn't.
Well, one didn't, Dan Walker.
Dan Walker.
The others all went to jail.
Tied to their, well,
because of their governmental activities.
Governor George Ryan was more for what the Secretary of State, though.
Oh, okay, yeah. It was still a governmental situation, though.
Yeah.
But Dan Walker, his situation was completely divorced from his being governor of Illinois.
Right.
Yeah.
Otto Kerner, what kind of a governor was Otto Kerner? What kind of a man was he?
Otto Kerner was a genteel, debonair individual, always wore vested suits, very distinguished, was a scholar in every sense of the word, had been a top military officer. He demanded respect, and I was very impressed with him as an individual when I first arrived here. And I was very young, Terry, and I was impressionable at the start, okay? But Kerner was, as I said, he demanded respect. I got to know him, of course, to some degree. He wasn't close to the press. He didn't like press conferences, and he didn't like to answer questions from the press. He quickly would go on the defensive, I noticed, in his rare press conferences and so on. But one-on-one, I found him to be fairly cooperative and conducive to taking questions and so on. I was very, very disappointed later on in life, as were many other people, when he ran into trouble on a situation that occurred while he was still governor, but wasn't disclosed until a number of years later. It involved his acceptance of, in a secret deal of racing track stock in exchange for influencing the awarding of favorable racing dates to a Chicago family that had one of the big tracks up there. I think it was Arlington Park. Mm-hmm. And that was a stunner. And that was the beginning of the modern era of governors being convicted of felonies and going to jail. Kerner was the first. Actually, Stratton, of the last 11 Illinois governors, 5 have been indicted for criminal activity. Of those 5, 4 were convicted. The one who wasn't convicted was William Stratton, a Republican who was governor in the 1950s. And after leaving the governorship, Stratton was indicted for income tax evasion, but he was acquitted at a trial, so he obviously did not go to jail. The other 4, Kerner, Dan Walker, George Ryan, and Rod Blagojevich, all were convicted of the charges against them, and all went to prison.
And we had, others. Governor Edgar. There was, I want to say this politely because he was never accused, but there was a trial with one of some of his supporters. So we get the point I would make is we get into these situations where issues come up, and one of the things that I would ask you, it's not that we want anyone to be engaged in criminal activity of any sort.
Of course not. But
are we having these governors, in your estimation, as you said, 5 of the last, 11?
11.
Is that because people are more corrupt these days, or do you think the corruption was always there, but we now are just holding governors, we're not looking the other way any longer?
I think you kind of answered your own question. I think the governors are under much more scrutiny now than they were, and there's always been a corruption factor at the highest levels of Illinois government, and that's true with most other states. But Illinois seems to have attracted a lot of attention for corruption at its highest level. I think that is because of several reasons. In Illinois, we've had aggressive U.S. attorneys in Chicago, and people can often name U.S. attorneys in Chicago because they make names for themselves by indicting high officials, be it members of the Chicago Democratic machine, be it Illinois governors, or what have you. In a lot of other places in the United States, no one knows who the U.S. attorney is because they don't make names for themselves by indicting high government officials. So Illinois, the corruption factor has been accentuated by the fact that we've had aggressive United States attorneys in Chicago, Jim Thompson being one, of course, obviously.
Jim Thompson
right.
Became famous because he had indicted
Otto Kerner.
Otto Kerner.
Exactly. Now,
he was a federal judge, we should say. Kerner had been appointed to the federal bench by Lyndon Johnson.
Federal appellate judge. Right, incredible. Now, I also want to point out, though, to buttress what you just said a minute ago, that the behavior and the practices of some past governors are no longer being tolerated. And George Ryan is a good example. Many, I don't want to say apologists, but backers of George Ryan have said that he didn't do anything that a lot of his predecessors didn't do. And there is some truth to that, Terry, that
they changed the rules of the game on him, right?
They changed the rules, and George got caught in the middle of the stream, as they say, because some of the things for which he was indicted have been going on for years under other top Illinois officials, be they governors or secretaries of state or treasurers or what have you, attorney generals. But the U.S. Attorney in Chicago decided to draw the line on George Ryan and make an example of him, and of course he did. And that doesn't excuse the fact that George Ryan was convicted of a number of federal charges in respect to his governorship, and as you said, going back to his years as Secretary of State. But at the same time, some of the things for which Ryan was convicted were obviously practices in past administrations, and the numbers of those individuals were never called.
As you who have been involved in reporting on public policy
right.
For 50 years, Is Illinois deserving of its reputation as one of the most corrupt states, or are we somehow just where we've changed the rules of the game and therefore all of a sudden we're filtering people through a different prism than we did before?
I think, unfortunately, Illinois is deserving of its reputation as a relatively corrupt state. I was not pleased, as were others, when Governor Blagojevich was indicted, and a top FBI official stood at a press conference in Chicago and said, because of this indictment and because of other things we're looking into in Illinois, Illinois may be surpassing Louisiana as the most corrupt state in the United States. Louisiana has a terrible reputation for corruption at the highest level. And for Illinois to be finally compared to Louisiana, I thought was the epitome of blacklisting Illinois in terms of governmental corruption.
You know, in fact, a number of years ago, I was talking to Larry Sabato, the political science professor at the University of Virginia, when I was in Washington, and he said, I put Illinois right up there with Mississippi and Louisiana for the most corrupt state in the nation.
He included Mississippi, huh?
Yeah.
That's unusual. I don't hear Mississippi included as much as, not as much as Louisiana.
And of course, Louisiana sent some of their own, like Edwin Edwards, some of their own governors, past governors, to jail.
Oh, yeah, right.
And the Kingfish from back in the 30s.
Huey Long, right.
Huey Long. I don't want to run through, I mean, just, we could spend all day just talking individually about different people and governors, but it's not just governors. There are significant people in the legislature. When you look back over a 50-year period, who are some of the personalities that stand out, and why do they stand out?
Well, I would think that probably, just to get to the heart of it, of the governors I either covered or knew or dealt with in one way or another, I think Richard Ogilvie was frankly the most outstanding governor in my time. I think he will go down as one of the great governors in Illinois history. Just bouncing around, James Thompson was incredibly charismatic and was able to rise above partisan politics and pretty much get whatever he wanted out of government. He could get whatever he wanted out of, he was a Republican, but a very moderate Republican, a middle-of-the-road Republican, and he could get whatever he wanted out of the Democrats. And then you look at George Ryan. George Ryan, if not for his downfall on the federal prosecution and subsequent conviction, George Ryan might have gone down as one of our best governors because he pretty much could get whatever he wanted out of the General Assembly. He could reach across the aisle, although Republican, and get Democratic support for whatever he wanted. He had a close relationship at the time with Mayor Daley, the second Mayor Daley of Chicago. They were very close, and they had a good working relationship.
How was his relationship with Mike Madigan? Do you know?
It was passable. It was passable. George Ryan was an old-fashioned wheeler dealer. He came up the hard way through the hardball politics of Kankakee County and knew the ropes before he ever got to Springfield. And he could deal. He could deal with top Democrats. And Mike Madigan would be included in that. I think they liked each other, and he dealt with Mike Madigan.
So you had Jim Thompson, moderate Republican. Jim Edgar would be a moderate Republican as well. Right?
Jim Edgar was a very moderate Republican. Jim Edgar was a governmental practitioner. He of course had been a legislator, and he had worked for Thompson as his legislative liaison and so on. And Jim Edgar knew politics. Jim Edgar, I think, was an exceptionally decent individual to have reached the highest rung of Illinois politics. I thought he was basically a nice guy, a nice gentleman. I've knew him for years, of course. And I think Jim Edgar was a case of an exceptionally decent, personally corrupt-free individual reaching the highest level of politics in Illinois. But he was not a backslapper, and he was not, to a lot of people, a warm individual. He was rather formal, and he, unlike George Ryan and unlike Jim Thompson, it would be an exaggeration, though, to say that Jim could get whatever he wanted out of Democrats because that wasn't true. I know that I used to try to follow his relationship with Madigan, and I think it was hot and cold, but it wasn't the same relationship.
I'll insert that Governor Edgar has said that during the first 4 years, he served 8. That Madigan was a constant thorn in his side, but he goes, for some reason, Madigan took pity on me. I may have been putting words in his mouth, but their relationship warmed up during the last 4 years.
I think that's true. I observed that, and I think that's true. That basically Madigan and Edgar could work out solutions to major problems, major issues affecting the state, and I know that. I don't think there was any love lost between the two because they were entirely different individuals in terms of where they came from and culture-wise and so on. But basically, Edgar, I think, was a live and let live individual and a pragmatic fellow and basically did a good job as governor of Illinois. There was the one scandal, but I should point out that it did not touch him personally.
It did not tank Governor Edgar.
And that, you got to, it did not. No. And you got to point that out.
Right.
And no governorship is free of one or more scandals, as we know. But
anyone can raise an issue, right? I mean, they investigate in
Jim
Governor
Edgar
Edgar.
gets high marks as a decent individual who did a good job and ran a responsible government, both financially and in dealing with issues and so on.
The other thing about Governor Edgar was he was a downstater. He was from Charleston area. And does that make a difference? I mean, we often hear about the divide between Chicago and downstate. Downstate virtually being anything besides Chicago and the collar counties.
Right.
When you go to Chicago, there is such a focus on the city and the city politics. It is very easy to fall into that mindset that you live in the state of Chicago.
No, that's true.
And then there's just this rest of this landmass that we call Illinois.
Right.
Does it matter, in your estimation, that a governor is a downstater versus someone from the Chicagoland area? When we look at the history of governors, so many of them are from Chicago.
Right. Well, I think it does matter. There's a historical, cultural divide in Illinois between the greater Chicago area and the rest of Illinois, so-called downstate. And it has always governed the way issues are addressed, the way government is conducted, and so on. And a downstater as governor is which we don't, it's hard to see again, as we sit here today. A downstater as governor sees things differently than a Chicagoan. You already said Chicago political leaders have a difficult time seeing a part of Illinois. I say south of I-80 around Joliet. Joliet is downstate to these guys, okay? And I think that there's always been a traditional downstate versus Chicago divide in Illinois. I think it's getting more pronounced. Chicago is gaining the upper hand in the situation because of the population disparity. Roughly 70% of the people in Illinois now live in the greater Chicago area. And the demographics are no longer there for downstate political individuals to exercise the say that they once did. There was a time when downstate could hold its own against Chicago in terms of political bargaining in the governmental scene in Illinois, in the General Assembly and in other ways. But we really don't have that anymore. Chicagoans are in a position where they can pretty much ramrod through anything they want now, because they really don't need to bargain and get downstate votes on issues. And I think that's rather unfortunate.
Why does it matter?
Well, I think it
as a practical
it matters
sense.
because the constituents of downstate politicians, be they legislators or what have you, really don't care about heavy financing of Chicago public schools, for example, or subsidizing mass transit in the Chicago area. And there was a time when and Chicagoans, for the most part, really could care less about poverty-stricken economic areas suffering downturns in much of downstate Illinois and so on. And they don't identify with a lot of downstate issues, be it agricultural, coal mining, or what have you. And I think that as long as we had some semblance of balance between the two, things could be worked out. But you know, downstate had a lot of political individuals who could deal with Chicago. And don't laugh when I say Paul Powell was one. Paul Powell did a lot of good for downstate Illinois in spite of the way his reputation ended up. But downstate doesn't have the Paul Powells anymore. It doesn't have the Clyde Shotes. And it doesn't have, we don't have governors from downstate. And so it's very difficult for downstate to get, in my opinion, fair representation in the halls of the State House. There are many parts of Illinois that, not just Chicagoans, but other downstaters don't know anything about. You've got counties in western Illinois, in the so-called Fregatonia area, that a lot of people couldn't even tell you what the names of the counties are, what the county seats are.
Well, I often point out to people, when's the last time we ever heard any news from Galesburg or Effingham,
right,
or Mattoon?
Right.
I mean, there are hundreds of communities across this state,
right,
that might as well be on the dark side of the moon as far as the coverage that we ever hear of life in those communities.
Exactly, exactly. And as more and more of them are being represented by Republicans, that doesn't necessarily help their status in terms of the high-level dealing at the state level, where you've got Democrats dominating the House, dominating the Senate, and dominating elective offices, although right now we do have a Republican governor, Rauner. But, you know, we're getting into a classic divide where Chicago, of course, is a Democratic behemoth, if that's the right word. But downstate is becoming more, it's always been Republican, but now it's becoming even more Republican than it was. But again, this is interesting, but yet it's not favorable for downstate in terms of dealing at the state level, because we don't have the people, and we don't have the demographics to compete with and sit at a table with Chicagoans. And so, you know, we have this divide, basically, in kindergarten language: Democratic Chicago, Republican downstate, but it's not as simple as that. Democratic Chicago right now holds all the aces in their hand if we're playing poker or whatever.
Yeah, I will point out, because I mean, as you and I talk sometimes when I do an interview, and this is one of them, I think of people watching this 50 years from now. I would point out that in the election of 2010, when we had Bill Brady, the Republican candidate for governor, running against Pat Quinn, who was a sitting governor, but anyway, Bill Brady won, I think, 99 out of 102 counties and lost the election.
Right.
So it goes to show how concentrated the political power is. And my point would be that Illinois has a geographic problem. Because
absolutely,
when you look at the political players that matter, there's only about 5 people in the state that hold significant political power.
That's right.
The governor, the president of the Senate, the speaker of the House, the president of Cook County, and the mayor of Chicago. And
throw in the assessor of Cook County just for fun. That's
yes, okay.
People often ask me, as an aside here, who are the most powerful individuals? What are the top 3 most powerful offices in Illinois? And I have an answer, and it's not a total joke. Number 1, Mayor of Chicago. Number 2, the assessor of Cook County.
And why do you say that?
Oh, the assessor of Cook County gets to appraise all the values of all the
property to be
buildings and the
taxed.
properties in Chicago. And gosh, look at what we're talking about. And number 3, governor.
Well,
that's kind of a joke,
and I don't mean this as a slight to any of the people currently in office.
Right.
But when you have this much concentration of power,
right,
if you're the minority leader in the House or Senate, you're not really, you have the title, but you don't have the political power to affect change.
You do not. Not as we sit here today in early 2017. What you said is exactly right. we do not have a balance of power in either chamber, legislative chamber, that really is necessary to address issues in a fair way that takes into account the concerns and needs of all parts of the state, not just the greater Chicago area.
I grew up in St. Louis. You worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch,
Right.
as we said. I often point out in this regard that if you were from the proverbial man from Mars and were trying to find a place to colonize, you would point out to your boss, I found a place in the richest nation on earth, on the biggest river in that country, smack dab north, south, east, west in the middle of the country.
Right.
It has heavy rail, light rail, barge traffic, major highways going right past it,
Right.
and major airports. And that's great. What is it? East St. Louis. And it's true.
I know.
And yet
know.
East St. Louis, for those who haven't been there, sits there and rots. It is an economic development officer's dream in many ways,
Right.
as far as what
Right.
assets are there to work with.
Right, right.
And I would argue that this is a reflection that it sits there and rots of the concentration of power being so much in Chicago with the Chicago blinders
Right.
on what issues matter that no one cares about in East St. Louis. And it's reflective, not to make it just about East St. Louis, but when you can overlook something like that and have it sitting there rotting
Right.
for decades,
Right.
it is reflective of the imbalance of power and how that manifests itself in a practical sense in life
Right.
in Illinois
Right.
at this point in time.
Ironically, you mentioned East St. Louis. And of course, I had to pay particular attention to East St. Louis in my reporting years for the Post-Dispatch, obviously.
Right.
And in my years, one governor went out of his way to try to help East St. Louis and temporarily did a lot of good for the city, and that was Republican Richard Ogilvie. And that's unusual because Ogilvie did far more to address the real problems of East St. Louis than any other governor in my lifetime. And
What did he do and why did it?
well, he for example, he set up, he pushed through legislation to create a community college in East St. Louis that didn't get any local funds. It was totally financed by the state. That was most unusual. The only higher educational institution, it was a 2-year community college that didn't depend on local taxes. There were no taxes assessed for it. That would have been an example. He went along with a lot of building projects in East St. Louis, capital projects that weren't done. On that, he cooperated with the federal government and so on. He did other things. He appointed East St. Louisans to key positions, and he gave the city a degree of respect in regard to the people coming out of it and so on. He was there a lot. For a while, East St. Louis had a Republican mayor while Ogilvie was governor. And he did a lot to try to ease. He addressed the racial relations in East St. Louis. And it was going through a catharsis at the time, a violent transformation from being a biracial city to one that is essentially all black. But that was not an easy thing to handle and deal with, and Ogilvie did a good job there, as good as he could at the time.
And of course, we should point out he was a one-term governor.
And he was a one-term governor, good point. And since then, no governor, in my estimation, has given East St. Louis any extraordinary consideration, nothing out of the ordinary, and East St. Louis has continued to plummet to debilitation, and what we have today is one of the major decrepit eyesores among municipalities in the United States.
There's many things. You're a fascinating guy, and there's a lot of issues, and we're never going to have enough time.
No.
So I want to move along just to some other areas. Again, you started out as a journalist. You've been covering these issues. You've written books. You're biographer of Governor Ogilvie, so you're well informed. Also of Russell Arrington, who was a major Republican senator and a powerhouse. Tell us just briefly, and I want to get into the state of journalism a bit as well.
Right.
But who was Russell Arrington, and why did he matter?
Russell Arrington was one of life's great success stories. Poor kid, grew up poor, born in Gillespie, Illinois, actually, who made it big as a lawyer in Chicago, became a wealthy lawyer during the Depression years in the 1930s when he became very schooled with handling bank foreclosures and bank failures and things like that. Got involved in politics, Republican politics, as a young man up on the North Shore, and eventually decided, was a big success as a lawyer, was a big success in business, but decided he wanted more. And he ran for and eventually got elected to the Illinois House in 1944, served 10 years in the House, and then got elected to the state Senate in the mid-50s. And it was there that he really came into his own. He decided to make his mission in public life his mission was to make the General Assembly a more meaningful branch of government. And Arrington, who was a very cold, callous individual, but
not warm and fuzzy.
Not warm and fuzzy, oh no, anything but. And very mercurial, very hot-tempered and so on, decided when he was at the helm in the Senate, he then was at the helm of a big Republican majority in the state Senate that could pretty much do what it wanted. He decided then to forge and drag the General Assembly into the 20th century and make it a more meaningful part of government. For example, the General Assembly only met every other year. It was a biennial situation. Arrington was the one who brought about annual sessions of the General Assembly. Arrington was the one who forged annual budgeting. Arrington was the one who, for the first time, made the General Assembly run on time. Committees met when they were going to meet. They reported out bills. He imposed deadlines that were met, and so on. He actually turned the General Assembly into
from a fraternity house into a professional organization.
Into a professional organization, and it did become a much more important part of Illinois government on a day-to-day basis. He wanted it to be more functioning on a day-to-day basis. Now, a lot of people argued with this, of course, and felt that wasn't the intent of the General Assembly.
Well,
He was the one who made what we now have in Illinois, a full-time General Assembly, a full-time legislature.
I was going to say, the lawmakers pay, am I not right? They used to get their entire salary on the first day.
I guess I've heard that. I'm not sure about that.
And then, so they didn't necessarily feel that they had to come in.
The pay wasn't very much.
Or come all the way down to Springfield.
No.
These days, well, as we speak, they're not even getting paid on time, but that's somewhat. Let me say this.
Arrington ran, though, the Senate with an iron hand.
Did he ever want to be governor?
He talked about it, but he was never sincere about it. For one thing, he had this prickly personality, and he would not have been a good campaigner statewide.
He wouldn't suffer fools gladly. Huh?
Oh, you couldn't put it any better. In fact, that's a phrase I'm his biographer, of course, and I put in there that he did not suffer fools lightly. And it didn't matter whether you were a fellow Republican or a Democrat or an independent. If you screwed up, Arrington was merciless in coming down on you, and he always did it in front of everybody. He didn't do it behind the scenes. I was a reporter in those years, Terry, and I would be sitting in the Senate press gallery covering it, and you always knew if it was a slow day covering the Senate, you were going to have a story to write before it was over, thanks to Arrington, the Republican leader, who was running the show from the floor. And Arrington would, if someone screwed up or someone was out of line or someone hadn't done what he or she was supposed to do, Arrington would give them a tongue lashing in front of everybody, fellow Republicans, Democrats, and so on. The joke was Arrington always had a big cigar, okay? And there was a tip-off. If he had the cigar in his mouth and it started going up and down in a nervous fashion, that was wonderful because you knew somebody was in for a tongue lashing. Somebody had screwed up, and that was the clue that Arrington was ready to lash out at somebody. And everybody, all the other senators would be looking down at their desks. No one wanted to look up because no one wanted to be the target of his tongue lashing. But no, Arrington succeeded partly because people were afraid of him. He was a multimillionaire. He didn't need the money. He wasn't on the take, but he was very arrogant and very demanding and so on, and for a time, under Arrington, the General Assembly ran like a very smooth machine back in his time. In fact, Speaker Madigan had told me in interviews for my book on Arrington that Arrington was his model for a legislative leader, and that he was thought in many ways he was modeling his speakership after the leadership portrayed by Arrington when Arrington was in the saddle.
While we, as you said, you literally wrote the book on Arrington, so all these people we could talk about for an hour, but let's go to, we would be remiss if we didn't speak about Michael Madigan, who's been the speaker for all but 2 years for the last 34 years or so.
Incredible.
At the end of this term, as we tape this, he will be the longest serving speaker, I think, in the history of the United States. Mm-hmm. What is your take on Michael Madigan?
Michael Madigan is obviously an incredible individual. Number one, he's very smart. And I've often felt when he gets into these contests with other individuals, sometimes it's not fair because Madigan is so smart and so schooled and so researched and so up to date on everything going on that the people who might challenge him are just not up to it. In a crude term, Terry, most of them are not as smart as Madigan, so that's a big handicap to begin with, okay? Madigan is absolutely unbelievably efficient in marshaling power and using it. And I think that it was said that you take in redistricting and things like that, in which he's had an upper hand for years, you know, he knows in each district what, in each county, and this is downstate too, where Democratic votes are, where Republican votes are. He is so shrewd. He knows the backgrounds of every individual in the General Assembly. He knows their strengths, he knows their weaknesses, and he can play upon these, and that's what a powerful leader does. You've seen it in Congress through the years, and you see it in the Illinois General Assembly. He is he's extremely studious, and he concentrates, and I would say he's all business. And many are writing now that his main intent, his main occupation, his preoccupation is simply the maintenance of power. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
I was going to ask, what motivates him?
Well, obviously, he wants to be, wants to go down as perhaps the most powerful legislator in I guess,
I mean, if someone asked me,
history, you know?
If someone asked me from covering the State House, what is Michael Madigan's agenda? I don't know what his agenda is. He's not. I know where Governor Rounder talks about his agenda. Michael Madigan doesn't talk about it.
There's not an ideological agenda where Michael Madigan is concerned. Number one, you retain power, and when you have the power he has, then you can get things done. And then he can pick and choose which issues of the day he wants to address. And if he goes into something seriously, there are many instances through the years, during his many years in power, where Madigan has forged, worked out, maneuvered a very reasonable solution to a difficult problem plaguing state government or plaguing the citizens of Illinois. But on the other hand, he's a very stubborn individual. He is not used to being challenged. He doesn't like to be challenged. And his back gets up, the hair on his neck gets up pretty quick when someone takes him on or he perceives someone to be taking him on. And that can bring about the kind of situation we have now, where I think it's a very personal standoff between Democrat Madigan and Republican Governor Bruce Rauner. And I think that it's gotten down to a place where the interests of the state are temporarily, and the populace are temporarily shoved aside or put on a shelf for the time being, while we work out this circling, this duel between two incredibly powerful and obviously stubborn and intent on winning individuals, Madigan and Rauner.
I was going to say, this is, would I be right in saying that this is devoid of politics? It is a personality power struggle.
Oh, a personality power struggle is certainly part of it. There's no question about that. Because Rauner is a kind of individual that Madigan
And Madigan has never had an opponent
of this. Has a difficult time abiding, right?
Of this caliber.
Madigan's never had anybody in his peak years of anybody attempting to stand up to him like this. So.
And able to block. They're blocking each other.
We
have two immovable forces.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And as a result, we have Illinois held hostage.
That's right.
What does it say, going back to what you were saying about Jim Thompson and Jim Edgar and George Ryan, Republican governors who worked with Mike Madigan?
Right.
I'm trying to phrase this in a neutral way, but what does it say about that things still moved through the state? We had budgets, we got things done. That today we find ourselves where we are, where nothing's getting done.
Well, you say, why are we here? Because Rauner was elected to try to address some serious situations in Illinois, mainly the huge fiscal deficit in which we find ourselves in Illinois. And you can't blame Rauner for that. I mean, okay, well, I think we can agree on that.
The state was messed up before Rauner came into office.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, Speaker Madigan is undeniably part of the situation, maybe a major part of the situation that has led us to our financial impasse, our financial crisis in which we find ourselves in Illinois. Rauner is, has wanted to take the bull by the horns, and on this score, I think that Rauner should deserve some credit for trying to change things. Now, I mean, also, we have this situation where he's insisting on certain reforms in terms of the business climate and so on. Mm-hmm. And here in Illinois, and the press included, depicts him as wanting radical changes, right to work, property tax freezes, and so on. If you want to be fair here,
redistricting and term limits.
Yeah, right. If you look around in other parts of the Midwest, no further than Indiana, now Missouri with right to work, Rauner's not asking for anything that is really radical or that has already not been put in place to a great extent in states bordering Illinois. Wisconsin, Indiana, Governor Kasich has accomplished a lot of this in Ohio. In Missouri, even where we've had a Democrat in the governor's chair, many of the business reforms
now a Republican.
Now Republican, but the Democratic governor in Missouri, though, was in accord with a lot of the so-called business reforms that Rauner's wanted. So it's not that Rauner has this radical agenda. That's not the case. If you look at the fact that much of what he wants has been adopted, again, in Missouri and Iowa and Wisconsin and Indiana and Ohio.
Well, as I say, in a tug of war, you can't blame one side for pulling on the string, right?
Good way to put it. Good way to put it.
But at what point do we do so much lasting damage? I mean, we have these two people butting heads, and in the meantime, we're driving different people out of business. Right. We're doing it just all kinds of damage, to nonprofits who provide social services, to people running a pizzeria place in some of the college towns, mm-hmm. where the students are now not going there because of the budgetary problems and woes. It might take years to build a building, but you can burn it down in a half an hour.
That's right. That's right.
So I don't know what. I would say for the historical record, there's a lot of frustration right now about where Illinois is. I don't even know that I have a question to add to that.
Absolutely.
It is something I would say relative to your 50 years experience that we have not faced before.
Oh, absolutely not. No. I have never seen anything like this before. These guys are breaking new ground every day with this situation as it continues year after year.
And doesn't it not somewhat point out that maybe we need political reforms because we have too much power vested in too few?
I agree with that. I
mean, all the backbenchers in the legislature are frustrated too, of both parties.
Of course they are. And I think that it's a shame that a lot of individual legislators don't assert themselves more. I mean, they are independently elected, and they
Well,
represent.
we saw what happened to
constituency.
Kenny Duncan when he did.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's
A
good-
Democrat
that's a
who
good point.
broke with the speaker and was
That's
quickly
right.
dispensed.
That's a fair point to bring up. But I think that several things have happened. The so-called cutback amendment that was pushed through by then political activist Pat Quinn back in 1980.
Can we back up, because I wanted to bring that up,
Okay,
but
okay.
let's, one of the things, this, I've never heard of this before as a student of government, and this happened before I was in Illinois. But we had, as a state, 3-member districts,
That's
which
right.
which I have never heard of, as I said, in
Well-
any other state anywhere else. But a lot of people that I've talked to who recall that
Right.
spoke favorably of it.
It was the so-called cumulative voting system, where in each House district, the majority party in the district elected 2, but the minority party always had 1 of the 3 seats. And that gave the minority party a voice, and it meant that the leadership of the House couldn't be as autonomous and all-powerful as it is now. That cutback amendment eliminated the cumulative voting system. It reduced the number of reps, and it introduced, single-member districts. And the biggest effect of it has been to make the speakership an all-powerful office. It actually ended up enabling the
And I want to
speakership.
explain why that is. Because before, when you had 3-member districts,
Right.
then even in the city of Chicago, you would have Republican
Yes, you
state
did.
representatives.
Yes, you did. Now, sometimes I will tell you this:
They were Democrats
in
disguised
disguise.
as, yeah.
Okay, but still,
They
your
really
point is
were
well-
rhinos,
But,
right?
but your point is well taken, and
And conversely, you had
yeah,
Democrats
yeah.
in heavy
in
Republican
downstate
areas.
heavy Republican areas, you always had 1 Democrat, and it served to really diffuse the situation and not let any one party have complete power, and that was important, And you didn't have the lopsided situation that you've had now, or have had for a number of years. And once again, it provided for a leadership situation in a House where you had to take into consideration all concerned. The Democrat may be in the speakership, but Republicans could not be ignored, and vice versa. But by eliminating that cumulative voting system, it allowed the leadership in the House to become all-powerful. And I think that in looking back, that's probably not been a totally good thing.
One of the things I really wanted to talk about as well, and again, we're already going long, but let's get to the state of journalism.
Right.
We had talked when you and I first broke into journalism. We would write our stories on typewriters.
That's right.
And among the changes, and one of the primary ones, which is certainly having an impact on the world of journalism, is the technology and the impact that's having on existing business models. It's obviously breaking down newspapers. It's breaking down radio stations.
Right,
People can put out their own podcasts. Someone like the Illinois Channel doesn't have to have a broadcast box with an antenna.
right.
So we can distribute video
Right.
across platforms. So it's both good and bad.
Yeah.
The bad part is to the extent that it's breaking down old business models, and a lot of journalism
Right.
entities
Right.
are withdrawing their reporters from the state capitol
Absolutely.
and covering it.
And I think that's a shame. I think the public is ill-served by the decreasing importance, relevancy of the press room in the Illinois State House. I'm a throwback to another era, as you know, Terry. I wrote my stories on a typewriter. Can you believe it, that I went and filed stories at night at Western Union?
send the story down to
Western Union
St.
sent my
Louis.
stories to St. Louis. Now, that's really going back. That's like saying I'm from the Pony Express era. I'm not quite that old, but it is a valid comparison. When I came here, the press room was a very vibrant situation. You had 4 major Chicago dailies competing every day for stories, not just the Tribune and the Sun-Times. You had the Chicago Daily News, and you had the Chicago's American, later Chicago Today. And they competed daily. You had more than one. You had not just the Associated Press. You had the United Press International. You had several independent news services like the Chamberlain Loftus News Service. You had freelancers who served different papers. They were here and were making a living. You know, many of the, you had the two St. Louis dailies had bureaus here. Not
the Globe
just
Democrat
the
and the
Globe
Post-Dispatch.
Democrat and the Post-Dispatch.
One
Right.
Republican, one a Democratic paper.
Yeah, now I will say...
now the Post wouldn't say they were Democrat.
I worked for a Democratic paper, no question about that, but I tried to be fair, believe me.
Right.
Okay. But, you know...
Editorially,
you
on the
had-
editorial
yeah,
page, we
but
should say.
you had like the Lindsay Schaub chain and a lot of individual papers had folks here on an almost daily basis. And
So
when the
so
legislature-
now that we're not, what I mean, you know, this right as we sit here, we had this spring, I think, 5 reporters leaving the Illinois State Capitol Press
Right,
Corps. There
right.
used to be, you might have 30
When
reporters
the
there,
General
and now
Assembly was in-
we're getting down to like we have 12 or so.
When the General Assembly was in session, you had 25 to 30 reporters
Yeah.
here because Rockford would be here, Peoria would be here.
Not anymore.
Waukegan would be here
Yeah.
and so on. And no, not anymore. And Champaign-Urbana, they would all be here, you know, and you don't have this anymore. And I think this is a shame because you don't have...
This sounds a little bit like belly aching of reporters for their, but it's more than that because we are losing the tenuous thread that connects us to what's going on in public policy.
Right. Well, what is happening is that I really fear, I'm a print journalism guy, obviously. I'm an old newspaper guy, so I'm prejudiced in favor of newspapers. That's my life story.
Right.
Okay. I really fear, Terry, for the future of print journalism. I really do, especially in terms of the big city dailies. There are more reasons I feel for this than we want to go into today. Now, I think papers in middle-sized situations will survive, like the Wayne County Press and Pana and the Southern Illinois and so on. But the big boys, the big folks are facing a certain future. You go through the offices of a lot of newspapers today and you see empty cubicles all over the place. It's not just the State House press room, it's in the home offices of the newspapers. They don't, and state government coverage, since that's what we're talking about here, has suffered greatly. I was part of an incredible investigative era in State House journalism from the mid-'60s up until the late '70s, and we don't have that anymore. And in my time here, I was part of it, but there were a lot of good investigative reporters. Some of the best in the country came out of our State House here, and we really set a model for State House investigative reporting in the Illinois State House. And I've written about it, and I mention it in all my books, and I rehash it whenever I can because I was very proud to be part of a golden era of State House journalism here in Illinois.
Well, and I was going to say,
we don't have that anymore. We
right.
just
I want
don't.
to point out. I mean, just to point out something that's rather maybe obvious, but the nature of the news business is there's good TV stories, there's good radio stories, there's good print stories. A budget story is not a good TV story because you can't
Right.
talk numbers
Right.
and if people remember them, but you can
Right.
read the numbers.
Right.
But TV, which typically does a package story that's a
Right.
minute and a half to 2 minutes long,
Right.
is not a good medium to do investigative
Right.
reporting.
Right. Right.
And people don't want to put the resources, the ownership
No,
doesn't
of
want to
course
put the
not.
resources to have someone work on a story for months
No.
that is needed to uncover
Right, right.
whether it's corruption. Let me jump ahead I mean, you can respond to that, but let me just ask something else and maybe weave this in. The other thing that happened during your era and mine was the Watergate story,
Right,
which to
right.
me changed journalism because
It did.
before then, let me say after Watergate,
Right.
and with the fame that came to investigative reporting from Woodward and Bernstein,
Right.
you had all sorts of people who wanted to be the next Woodward and Bernstein,
Right,
and
right.
their idea of journalism was that they were going to look for corruption, which is fine, but I think it also accentuated a different attitude in journalism, that there was more hostility, more of a confrontational journalism
Right.
than a mere reporting. Am I right in that?
No, you're right about that. You're right about that. Now, I pointed out
Is that a good thing or a bad thing, or what? How should
I
journalists?
think it's neither all good nor all bad. I think it's
professionally, how should they behave themselves?
Well, I think basically you still got to approach coverage in a fair and balanced fashion, not to be trite in my use of words. And I think that what we're seeing today is advocacy journalism. I'm not going to get into the national situation. We've just elected, as you and I sit here, Donald Trump as President of the United States. But I think that regardless of how you feel about Trump, I think you're seeing an aggravated sense of what you've just talked about, of where the journalism community on a whole is very aggressively negative towards Trump, and that's just my opinion. I know.
I would think any objective observer would say that.
When people watch this, they may argue, but I'm going to say that. It's not whether
I think
you agree with
some
Trump or
people
not,
would argue that they should be, but I think it's hard to argue that they are not. I think they are.
There's very little objectivity in the coverage of Trump, and I think this is going to further diminish the role of the media in its responsible role in our American democracy, Terry.
People won't see it as
I think it's a shame what we're seeing now. This doesn't mean you don't go into all the foibles and the misstatements of Trump and all that stuff, but to deliberately try to assassinate the man with straight news stories and so on, this is going to backfire. You know, before the election, and now we're talking nationally for a second, before the election, I was asked by several downstate papers to prophesize what was going to happen. I'll admit to you, I predicted Hillary Clinton would win. I said it might be closer, though, than a lot of people think. But I said, regardless of who wins, a loser is going to be the media. And I really stick by that, and I think that's true. And I think that this lack of confidence in the media and what people are watching is only going to further downgrade the necessary responsible role of an honest media in our democracy, and I think that's a shame.
What would you say to journalism schools in the training of journalists, as far as, or just to journalists people who aspire to be journalists? What would you say to them as far as, here's how you should conduct yourself?
Well, I went to a journalism school, Missouri, University of Missouri, and I was taught the basic. It was stressed there that you have to be fair and balanced. The Post-Dispatch was a very liberal paper on the editorial page and so on. But the editors of the Post-Dispatch, who basically molded me, whatever I've done has been because I've been molded by the editors of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. They insisted on fair and balanced coverage. There was never, the situation was never all black or all white. There was always a middle ground, and you never wrote a story where it was all on one side and so on. There was always two sides to every story. And I just felt that we need more of that. I don't know, I'm not familiar, I've been away from journalism schools for a long time. I've not been to a journalism school for decades. I don't know what they're being taught. I do know that there's a very liberal slant on college campuses. There's no arguing with that. And I think it probably pertains to the journalism schools as well as to other aspects of major university campuses. I just think that there's got to be more emphasis on, you approach a situation never with an axe to grind ahead of time or with an edge or whatever. You've got to have an open mind, and I just don't see that in terms of a lot of individuals. I think you take these young PAR folks that come through
Public Affairs Reporting
folks that come through the program out at UIS and so on. And I know, I speak to them every year, as do some other individuals and so on. And in talking with them, it's obvious they're all Democrats. Well, this is fine. At one time, I probably was a young Democrat myself, but I didn't let it show. And
I think your point would be, you don't want to be. Whether it's okay to be a Democrat.
Yeah.
The problem is, if you don't give the other side their due and listen.
Absolutely.
I just had an intern from one of the primary journalism schools send me an article as an example on sanctuary cities. Well, there was nothing in the article, and I didn't publish it on their website.
Right.
There was nothing at all in that article about why one would be opposed to a sanctuary city.
About the negative aspects of sanctuary cities.
And I said, you have to be
I know.
bound. There's other
I
sides to
agree.
the story. So
and
this
that's the only point
this
I'm
is the
trying to
problem
make.
that you
This
get.
is the problem, and you diagnose it very accurately. You know, you've got to present both sides. Even a situation may appear one-sided, and we're not seeing that right now. And I think that, again, I think the biggest victims of what we're seeing are not going to be cable news, not going to be TV or radio. It's print journalism, and it's going to be the big city dailies. And I really question the future of, and I may live to regret this, but of the future of the New York Times and the Baltimore Sun, and so on and so on,
Yeah.
so on.
Well, and then we can only speculate what happens to our functioning democracy. Now, as the Illinois Channel is one example, there are a myriad of other media. So on one hand,
Right.
you don't have the people that used to be the gatekeepers to information.
Right.
As when you and I were growing up, we had 3 networks,
Right.
and that was all you have. Now
That's
you
right.
have MSNBC,
Right.
Fox News, Fox
Right.
Business News,
Good point.
CNN. So you can get different.
And that's all to the good. by
That's
the
all
way.
to the good, and
Right.
you can get some diversity of reporting, diversity
You certainly do.
of opinions. So, and plus you have the bloggers, and the bloggers were the ones that exposed the flaws in Dan Rather's report on George W. Bush
That's
some years
right.
ago. So we don't make it sound like we're just
all right.
belly aching about the good old days. That's not the
Right.
point.
Right.
Technology
Right.
changes.
Of course, of course.
But you still have to have some fundamentals of journalism, right? As far as
Yeah.
reporting facts,
Even with all the technology.
giving
and all
people
the,
their due, giving both sides.
and all the digital miracles, you still got to have an honest, open-minded approach to coverage of a situation. That can't change, in my opinion.
Now, Taylor Pensoneau, we could speak for hours. We've already spoken a lot longer. There's a lot to cover, and it was 50 years. I hope we can do it again sometime, but thank you.
I'd love to, Terry.
Thanks for your time.
I-
You're a wealth of information, and we'll recommend the books that you've written for people who want to know more.
Well, that'd be great.
All right. Thanks again.
Thank you, Terry.